All right, in our second series of lectures on nature of inequality, we're going to start looking at race and ethnicity and on the social construction of these categories. Often we say the phrase race and ethnicity together, but part of what we're going to do in this video is actually define what the two terms mean and examine the question of biology and race. The next video we'll look at the question of race and whiteness and the nature of privilege. We'll look at racism and discrimination. And in the final video, we'll look at patterns in racial inequality in the US. All of these, of course, very relevant topics in our current time. So then, what is race? Is race biological? Many people say, yeah, race is a biological category because largely what we look at is what we call phenotype. Phenotype refers to our external characteristics, what we look like on the outside. Our hair, our lips, our skin, our eyes, all our body size, all of those things would be our phenotype. And of course, racial groups look different. They have different phenotypes. And so the question is race rooted in our genes and our biology? Do racial groups have shared common biology? And we would think so, obviously, because they look alike, right? And that's where what we look like comes from our genes, or does it? In fact, there's a long history of people trying to find a biological basis for race. Classic example of this is Samuel George Morton. He did a study where he looked at the skulls of 3 different groups. He distinguished, the Negro group, the Anglo-Teutonic, and the Irish Iberian. Iberia refers to Spain and Southern Europe. So the Irish and Southern European folks, think Italy and Spain, were kind of lumped into a third racial category. And what he did was he measured the skulls of these different groups, and he proved, without a doubt in his mind, that in fact the Anglo-Teutonics had the largest brain capacity and the Negroes had the smallest. The problem with this study, beyond the fact that the size of your brain and the size of your skull doesn't mean a damn thing, is that when he looked at non-white or non-Anglo-Teutonic racial groups, he only looked at female skulls. Now, if we know one general thing to be true between men and women, it's that men tend to be slightly physically bigger, and this is true of their skulls as well. This says nothing about their intelligence or brain capacity, but he thought he was proving a definitive racial difference, or he wanted to say he was, when in fact he was pointing out an already known difference between men and women. So the question we want to ask ourselves is, why did he want to prove this difference between races? In fact, if I look at my genes as a Caucasian man and compare them to the genes of most of my students who are primarily African American and Latinx, the skin color we have on the outside is no determinator of what our genes look like. I could be just as similar to some of you as I could to, I don't know, Mitch McConnell, an old white guy in the Senate. Our external characteristics, these racial groupings, don't actually determine whether our genes are similar. Now, you might say, well, what about the whole sickle cell thing in the US? Isn't that a race trait? Doesn't that prove that races have common genetics? While only 100,000 Americans have sickle cell disease, but we see this trait is actually much higher in Black Americans. About 1 in 13 will have the sickle cell trait. That doesn't mean they will actually develop the sickle cell condition, which is a condition in which the red blood cells have a cyclical shape. And this causes various issues of the blood and can be a very difficult and painful disease. So we would think this is clearly evidence that Black folks have common genetics. But if we think about it historically, what we see on the map here in pink is concentrations of people throughout Europe with sickle cell trait. Notice this is concentrated in areas of the Middle East, in Italy, as well as in Western Africa. The map on the right is the distribution of a population of mosquitoes that tends to carry malaria. What's the overlap here? Well, sickle cell tends to protect you from malaria. So in areas where malaria is a major killer, sickle cell trait actually acts as a protector and is selected for genetically, meaning that more of these folks will survive. Now, if we think about historically what happened over here on the western coast of Africa that would connect to African Americans, the slave trade. So if people who we would group into the race of black were selected from maybe this eastern coast over here of Africa or from the southern tip of Africa, we wouldn't find that common genetic trait. It's not that all these folks have common genes, it's that more African Americans have the sickle cell trait because they were taken through the slave trade from a part of Western Africa where it was very common. So even this seeming racial genetic commonality was created by a social institution, a brutal, violent one, slavery. This science of race has a long history. We've already seen old Samuel Morton, but people have measured all parts of the body, including the brain, what's called craniometry. We see arms, hands, feet. People have tried to find one thing that's common to all members, or mostly common to all members of a race, black, white, but they don't. And indeed, the study proves that there's an assumption of a common biological difference, but there isn't one. Right? While they may, in some sense, externally look the same, if we think about who's categorized as black or white, they have very different types of hair, very different shades of skin, very different external characteristics, and certainly different genes. So what is race then? In sociology, race is seen as a socially constructed group. If we go back to our earlier section, we'd know it was a category. It is imposed from outside. And it's based on the idea of shared phenotype and ancestry and maybe biology. But there's not necessarily a shared phenotype and ancestry. Someone may come from the West Indies, from Jamaica. They're still called African American, even though they didn't come from Africa. Most of our genetics say, in some sense, we're all from Africa. That's where the first humans originated. So race is socially constructed. Nobody was doing blood tests when they got off, the boat on the coast of Africa to try to violently round up people for exploitation of labor. They were looking at folks who they categorized as black. It is rooted, this construct, in a colonialist and historical history. It was used to justify the mistreatment by white people of color. And at that time, that actually included Irish and Eastern European people. They were seen as a lesser race. While race might not exist biologically, it certainly has a social reality. While we may not be able to root it in some common genetic test, it has an enormous impact on our day-to-day lives. And we're going to be looking at that through the next 3 videos.